Good evening and welcome to the Town of Sandwich Finance Committee meeting for March 3rd, 2025. Tonight's meeting is being aired on Sandwich Community Television and will be available for replay. It's 6 p.m. and I'm calling our meeting to order. Let's begin by rising for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As a reminder to the committee and myself, let's remember to turn our microphones on and speak clearly into it so that those at home and those with us in the hall can hear us well. The Finance Committee offers 2 public comment opportunities during our meetings for us to hear from our fellow residents. Does anyone with us tonight wish to speak? Please come forward. Join us right over here, please, and just make sure that microphone's on and state your name and address, and comments are limited to 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Gene Perini. I live at 6 Piccadilly Road, Sandwich, Massachusetts. And looking at the budget documentation that you have available on the website, namely the summary budget document, the projected revenues and expenses for the fiscal year 2026, I was wondering if there could be another piece of information that's included on that summary budget document, namely, what would be the average tax bill for Sandwich residents based on that budget? Now, I know assumptions would have to be made to arrive at that information, but we make assumptions for discretionary aid. We make assumptions for Chapter 70 school aid. We make assumptions for health and retirement benefits. So I just think that that's another piece of information that could be very helpful. And as budgets, and as the information on the budget changes based on new information that you get, we can see the change in the average tax bill for the town residents. And also, one other piece of information is I know, in addition to the revenues that we receive, tax levy revenue and general receipts, local receipts, we also receive funds from the federal government and state aid. So is there a document that details that with the balances? I could have missed it in the information, but I think it would also be good and helpful if that accompanies the summary budget documents. So just a couple of pieces of information, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Andrew, you can have your seat. I want to thank Crystal for filling in for me unexpectedly last week, and to the committee and to the town administrators for the expressions of condolences sent along to me. I very much appreciate your support. Thank you. Under correspondence, statements, and announcements, does anyone else have anything to add at this point? Okay. Bud, could you lead us off with any updates to the budget you may have for us this evening? And then on our main topic to review and discuss this evening, which was going to be on wastewater program implementation with Dave Mason. So take us through the plans and your discussion there.
So really, we haven't gotten any new information from the state based on the numbers that we got in late January. Really, the only thing that's changed, and in a way it came out better than we thought, was that health insurance number that we had talked about for the last few meetings. This Thursday night at the select board meeting, the plan is to take a vote either on recommending the base budget or the optimal budget with the additional DPW infrastructure funds. So I'll be able to report back on that next Tuesday, provided they vote on Thursday. And I guess with that, you want me to just jump into the wastewater? So I thought I'd give a brief overview, introduce Dave Mason, and then we're going to tag team different parts of it. We tried to get our thoughts down for the last few weeks on this outline, and our hope is that the outline would be thorough enough so as we gave other updates throughout the next couple of years, that could sort of form the basis and we could update it as we went along. I think it's fair to say if you took a look at any of it in advance, like, it's a really complex issue with a lot of moving parts. For better or for worse, we don't control some of the bigger things, which I think when we go through this in more detail, you'll see. It's so complex on some of the things. We were hopeful if we could just get through the presentation and then questions at the end, that might be best. And there's a couple of the attachments I thought I'd just throw up on the screens because they're good reference points. There's other attachments in there we just put as an example to show what our efforts have been through the years and what we're trying to get responses from, especially at the federal and state level. So we didn't plan to go through those in a lot of detail, but it was more the bigger picture maps and some of the cost estimates that we'll show. So I think Dave's going to start off, but I should just quickly introduce Dave. Dave Mason is our retired health director. We were very fortunate in that in his many years with us, he was our primary contact for wastewater matters. And after he retired, he agreed to sort of stay on board as a CWRMP, which is probably the acronym you'll hear the most tonight. That's Comprehensive Water Resources Management Plan. Our CWRMP coordinator. So we pay, so he works anywhere between 0 hours a week and 15 hours a week, depending on what the needs are. We pay for that cost from the WIIF funds that we bring in, and we'll talk about WIIF a little bit later. But I'll start off with Dave because there's a bigger overview that we need to share, and then we'll get into some more of the details.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. And just for a quick little history here is what brings us to this, what we're discussing tonight. It was back in the late 90s, early 2000 that the state DEP came to the town and introduced the Massachusetts Estuary Program, which required the town to go out and set up a sampling routine and sampling sites for Old Harbor and Scorton Creek. Over a period of 3 years, we had 21 volunteers sample 46 different sites over the 3-year period, and that was paid for through grant money that we received. So there was no, local tax money associated with that work. And then we took that work and applied for a grant through the state also with the Textron grant. It was out on the military base. The state DEP and Textron came to an agreement for their contamination, in which they had to provide monies that town could apply for, and we applied for approximately $850,000 to do our CWRMP, and our CWRMP is called a Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan. Many towns are called Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plans. Ours had to be referred to as a Resource Management Plan because of the conditions of the grant money we received from the state associated with the contamination on the base. Once we received that money for the development of the Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan, there was the selectmen appointed a committee made up of individuals from each board in the town and citizens at large, which took a period of 2 years to prepare the Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan with input from the public and the committee, which leads us to the document we're now working with today. Just so you have an understanding where the basis of that document came from, it's available on the website. It's 2 volumes, okay? So as far as looking into the wastewater issue, with that knowledge, it's approximately 100 plus years of issues from the 1970s, votes in the 1970s. Just so you know that the town was offered 90% reimbursement for sewering in the town of Sandwich, and the town of Sandwich voted it down because it was going to bring, there was a fear that it would bring more people. And regardless of that, more people showed up, and we don't have wastewater at 90% reimbursement, nor shall we probably ever see that again. It's the largest capital project and environmental issue on the Cape that we're dealing with. And on the Cape, we have less than 4% of the mass population, but more than 20% of the septic systems in the state. In our work, you know, it impacts more than just, it's more than just wastewater. It's water quality of ponds, our drinking water quality, the estuaries, and as I said, the public drinking water supply and protection of that. And all the towns are addressing that. I'm sure you've seen in the paper that recently a number of towns, Down Cape, Yarmouth, Dennis, have appropriated large sums of money associated with implementation of their comprehensive plan. Also is Barnstable. If you've traveled down there, you're seeing all the detours associated with the sewer lines that are going in and the construction of lift stations that are occurring in that town. And but as far as what Sandwich is dealing with, it's far less than. I spoke about, you know, that compared to other towns. I mentioned that, you know, the Mass Estuaries work that was done on Old Harbor and Scorton Creek, it was to determine whether or not those estuaries were impaired and exceeded the total maximum daily load of nitrogen that the estuary could handle. Our 2 estuaries that we have in this town, Old Harbor and Scorton Creek, are not impaired, but we do contribute to 3 impaired estuaries, and we'll speak to that further. But for the most part, our project here is pretty simple. And if you look at the costs associated with it, it may seem a lot, but compared to other communities, it's quite less in terms of what we're dealing with. The Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan was approved in 2018. Part of that development of that plan was Attachment 1, which shows the phases of implementation in the town of Sandwich. The committee, it was determined by the committee what areas should be in Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. Phase 2 and Phase 3 are typically within impaired estuaries associated with Wacoit Bay, Pompanesett Bay, and 3 bays. The reason those were pushed out into later phases is to determine what kind of work we could do with our abutting communities in Barnstable, Mashpee, and Wacoit. Instead of sewering those areas, potentially what we could coordinate with those other towns to address our contribution. So as far as the wastewater planning map and actions, if on attachment if you take a look at attachment 2 for the Sandwich Water Resources, the X marks the spot where we'll be talking about on the next attachment as far as where the land is available for the town to take care of the wastewater treatment plant and disposal. Pink is the Zone 1, which encompasses the majority of the town. The orange dots are actually the Zone 2s associated with the town wells. Attachment 3 identifies our identifies that section on the map that was marked with the X that shows the land that's available for wastewater disposal in the town currently. And that was approved at town meeting back in 2012. The voters decided to set aside this land for the purpose of wastewater. So, as I previously said, as an attachment 4, the impaired estuaries that we contribute to are Pompanesett Bay, 3 bays, and Wacoit Bay. Just for discussion, Pompanesett Bay, we contribute 9.5% of Sandwich's effluent goes to Pompanesett Bay, 7% goes into Three Bays, and 6% goes into Aquoit Bay that we contribute, and we'll be responsible for removing that percent of nitrogen contributed in those estuaries. Currently, we have intermunicipal agreements that are drafted or in place with those three towns, as far as one, acknowledging our contribution to those estuaries and the responsibility to address it. And with that, and this was done prior to the state implementing the nitrogen sensitive area regulation that the state put in through the Title V in July of 2023, if I have that right, but it was in July, which basically said that the towns have to put in place and develop watershed permits on how they're going to remove their percent of contribution. And we put in place a notice of intent for each of the watersheds, which delayed the regulatory action in those watersheds, which eliminates the need for innovative alternative systems, and until we come up with a game plan on how we're going to handle wastewater in those areas. And then the U.S. Supreme Court and the Maui and treated effluent disposal, there's a number of issues that are outstanding and hurdles. This is one of them we'll speak to later on, as far as the Maui decision was basically how we dispose of wastewater in proximity to the ocean. I'll simply put it that way, and so that we're not impacting that. So the watershed permits for the three embayments, the goal is for the completion of those agreements in 18 months. The concept is nitrogen credit trading, which would be looking at working with those communities and paying those communities to sewer additional areas in those communities to address the percent of contribution that we currently send, that they would sewer closer to the impaired estuary, thus allowing greater impact. Because when you start looking at those areas of town, which was in that attachment 1, those areas are, those lower areas are quite spread out, and it would be very costly running sewer in those areas. And we're looking at working with those communities, because we feel that it would be less expensive to sewer, in addition to, sewer in those towns, and expand their additional sewering footprint. As far as, so those notice of intents that I mentioned were filed for all three. They're placed a hold on regulatory requirements until those watershed permits are developed and approved by DEP. And then updating the nitrogen impact scenarios. Currently, I'm working with Ed Eichner through SMAS as far as updating our flow of nitrogen contribution in Three Bays, so that we can come up with some specific definitive numbers of how much we need to reduce, because those numbers, our nitrogen contribution was calculated back in the early 2000s, and we need to update for what development has occurred since then. For Three Bays, it's pretty minimal, but we still want to know specifically what that number is when we're dealing with Barnstable, so we're identifying proper costs associated with that. And then also we're working with Mashpee at looking at a sewering project near the Sandwich border to cover some of Sandwich and some in Bourne in a cooperative arrangement, which will also help with addressing some of the nutrients impacts associated with Pimlico Pond and Wakeby Pond. Currently, there's, as it's been in the paper, as far as algae blooms or cyanobacteria bacteria associated with nutrients, that we're looking for a twofer, I'll say, that we can address the nitrogen issue while at the same time addressing some of the other issues associated with those nutrients, such as phosphorus. And the Mashpee GHD, who works for Mashpee, is currently looking at that potential program.
So I guess I'll take the next three topics. So the first is our efforts that we've been trying to work with the officials and the different parties that out at Joint Base Cape Cod or JBCC. If you look at the implementation map in the CWRMP, it's telling almost all of those areas that are colored are very close to the base boundaries. After many years of trying, the U.S. Air Force within the last 2 years signed over ownership and operation of both the water and wastewater systems at JBCC to a private company called Converge Partners. Converge, in turn, has contracted with a utility services company, American States Utility Services, or ASUS, to physically run the plant out there. Dave and I and Heather Harper, the assistant town manager, we have monthly meetings with Converge and ASUS just to try to stay on top of things. In addition, I probably speak with the primary contact at Converge another 2 times a month, just to try to find ways to get answers. And I think over these next few sections that I'm covering, you'll probably sense there's a general frustration that we're trying to get feedback from state and federal regulators to give us an inclination of what we might be able to do either at the base or we'll have to do on our own. We've had a hard time getting those answers. In addition, the Joint Military Commands out at the base and the Adjutant General's office at the state level have been very supportive of those efforts with the base, and they've sent letters of support for some of the things that we've been working on. Probably most telling, through the State Community Compact program, they have a separate program called Regionalization and Efficiencies. We got 3 very significant grants. I think if you added the 3 together, it was about $800,000 for the 4 Upper Cape towns, and then Barnstable joined us for the last 2 grants to try to see how could the JBC system help the 4 Upper Cape towns plus Barnstable as we try to address our wastewater needs. There's a different size foot and a different shoe for every one of the towns. It's fair to say Sandwich has been the driver because we have the most, I believe, to gain if we could find a way to work with the base to handle both of our phase 1 efforts, but then also if we had to expand and go into phases 2 and 3 decades from now. Just to give you a rough idea, right now the base is permitted to treat about 450,000 gallons per day. Their actual flows are under 75,000 gallons per day. Most of our phase 1 could be covered with the difference between what they're treating now and what they're permitted to treat. But if they accept any new effluent, they have to get permission from the state to accept that flow. So that's one of the hard things that we've been trying to figure out is, will the state allow Sandwich to contribute flow there that the base would treat and we would pay our fair share to try to hold down costs if we did things on our own. For rough perspective, each town is doing their own thing. If you've driven through Barnstable, as Dave mentioned, they're trying to do most of it internally within their community. Mashpee is doing quite a bit of work. Pompanesett is in really bad shape, so they're working hard. They've appropriated a lot of money to try to address that area. There's a small part of their plan that if they had to work with the base, they would like to, but they have alternatives if they don't. Falmouth really has their hands full because they have 13 impaired embayments in their town. We have none. They basically don't have a place to put their treated effluent because their whole town contributes to those impaired estuaries. So they're actually trying to permit right now, which Lord knows how long it might take, but they're trying to permit through the state and federal governments an ocean outfall of treated effluent. That is a big road for them to hoe, and but whatever the decision comes out, it will probably impact all the towns on the Cape. And that's one of the things that Dave mentioned, the Maui decision, and he'll mention it again later on. Basically, the Maui decision said even though effluent was being disposed of on land, it was eventually making it to the ocean. And so in effect, it was an ocean outfall, even though it was being disposed of, underground. If you look at the Cape and you know how water flows, I think we'd be hard pressed to say any effluent that we put anywhere eventually doesn't make it, takes time, it eventually makes it to the ocean. It may take decades, but right now the feds are trying to determine how that decision will impact our permits. I know I'm jumping around a lot. The total estimated flow that the 5 towns identified, along with the base's long-term needs, equaled about 4.5 million gallons per day. So what those 3 studies showed is if the base could find a way to treat and dispose of 4.5 million gallons per day, decades down the road, we would need it early on, but other towns would need it further down the road. All of us could benefit from having some type of partnership with the base to help either treat our wastewater or dispose of the wastewater. So what's been happening, the pinch point is really that disposal of the treated effluent. You can build a plant to treat whatever you want, and when new contaminants get found and it causes the price to go up, like PFAS, you can still do something in that plant to treat that. It's just you have to pay more to take out the contaminants and get the water quality in a better condition. So that's really the pinch point. So what I would say Converge and ASUS and us have been working on the closest is how do we find a way to increase that amount of treated effluent that can be disposed of on the base. The current rapid infiltration basins or RIBs that you might see when you drive along the canal, you go under the Sagamore Bridge, you go past the turnoff for Market Basket, you keep going, heading towards the Gallo Rink. On the left, there's a big open road that goes up and you'll see a big expanse. That's where the RIBs are. Those are permitted, I believe, to dispose of about 1 million gallons per day, but there's high levels of PFAS contamination in them, and what we've been told is we're probably going to have to find a totally new site, either on base or off base, for any treated effluent to be disposed of from the JBCC plant. So that's one of the harder things that we've been working on. And again, the actual treatment and the permitting for that plant is easy. It's the regulatory oversight and getting clear answers on the disposal that's really the hang up. And then one of the questions that one of the select board members made last Thursday, which admittedly I hadn't thought that much about, is if we did partner with the base, what would happen if one of those BRAC processes or base realignment and closure process, which had taken place about more than 15 but less than 20 years ago, what if that was considered for JBCC as well? Like, how could that impact things? So that's one of the other things that we're still looking at. People on the committee may remember that in November of 2022, we went to town meeting with seeking the voters' support to file a special act on wastewater. And with that, we received extensive letters of support. I won't pull it up because it's words, not a picture, but attachment 5 in your packet is that actual special act. That was filed with the legislature shortly after the vote at the special in 2022. As of January of this year, it never got approved. And so basically it died on the vine. So we had to refile that, which we did just as a placeholder, verbatim of the former act. And in the meantime, we're trying to solicit as much feedback as we can from state officials, be it DEP or the state treasurer's office, to try to get any concerns that they may have in case we have to go back to a town meeting to revote the special act to try to address a couple of those points of concern. If you look at the act, I would say 4 of the 5 things it does are motherhood and apple pie for the most part. It allows us to grant easements and accept easements from the state if we went out on the base. It allows us to partner with our 4 neighboring towns and the base through intermunicipal agreements, which those 2 things are pretty much allowed by state law already. It declares that Converge, the company that runs the plant, is a sole source provider. There's no one else that's providing wastewater on the base. That doesn't seem like a high hurdle. And I think the other one talks about any lands that we might need or to share with other communities. I think the part that might be holding us up is right now when we cross the base boundary, even though it's in the in Sandwich, and we're connecting to a public entity, Joint Base Cape Cod, the company that now owns and runs the plant is a private company. And so technically, we would not be eligible once, under existing rules, once we cross the base boundary, we wouldn't be eligible for the state revolving fund, i.e. SRF, low interest loans, which in the old days really didn't do that much because we were able to borrow at 2-3%, but now that rates have gone up, it would lock in our interest rates at 2.4%. So that's very attractive. Most importantly, which I'll get to in a second, is it enables us to apply for and receive Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund monies. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So we're trying to get feedback from a couple of state departments if we have to go back to town meeting in May to slightly amend the special act. So we have been going back and forth on dates with the state treasurer's office. I'm confident by the end of the month we'll be meeting with them. I did show you an example in the packet of some feedback back and forth with DEP. We have not heard anything back. We have not gotten any clarity on any concerns they may have. And I think it's fair to say they're a little hesitant. They're used to getting a permit and reacting to a permit request. We're asking them a bigger picture question to try to get answered before we spend a ton of time and money trying to submit a permit that they may just say no to. We would like a little bit of feedback before we expended those monies. And I think what's sort of over the top of all of this is the PFAS contaminations that have been found out at the base and some of the decisions that the EPA has issued, for example, on the ocean outfall from the MWRA plant, what they've approved for other Cape towns down Cape. They seem to be limiting discharge and requiring people to treat to a higher level for PFAS, which is fine. Just tell us what we have to do. We're going to have to abide by it. So those are the type of things that we're struggling right now on how the special act relates to all of that. It's probably, fair to say that if the special act gets approved, JBCC could probably be the best option. While at the same time working with all our neighbors, we all have different needs at different times. If we can't get that special act through, it's probably unlikely that the JBCC will be our initial option. But down the road, I would think all 5 towns and the base will be working together in one way or another to try to assist each other, address all these problems. I think one thing that the Cape Cod Commission has done an excellent job with over the decades is to show us that, water that we have in Sandwich, granted, as Dave said, it fluctuates between 9 and 6%, those estuaries to the south. Like, we don't have a lot percentage-wise compared to those other towns, but we do impact those other embayments. So it crosses municipal boundaries. We already have, as Dave said, signed intermunicipal agreements with Mashpee and Falmouth for those 2 watersheds. And we have a draft one with Barnstable that, as Dave mentioned, we're trying to nail down some of the technical data on the percentage of contribution before we sign those. And so that's a good transition into what we're trying to do to to hold down costs as best we can. So the state revolving fund is part of it's actually the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, part of the Federal Clean Water Act. Again, you have to submit for actual projects, not for engineering or permitting. You have to submit actual projects to them. They review them. If you get on the SRF list and you get approved, eventually we would be able to lock in those low interest loans at 2.4%. But the biggest thing it allows us to do is the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund monies. Those were the monies that were established about 4 years ago through the short-term rental taxes, where 2.75% of any short-term rental stay on Cape has to pay a 2.75% tax that gets turned over and given to the county that oversees it. The Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund has a 25% principal payment policy annually once you issue debt. So that would be huge for us. I actually am the town's representative on that board. I've seen, Barnstable get several hundreds of millions of dollars of projects. Again, that's the total cost of the project. It's just 25% of their bonding, would get covered each year by that fund. So we've had to adjust how that money gets doled out to make it financially viable long-term, but all the long-term financial projections show that still works. So that's really important because truthfully, that's the bigger savings that we get, more so than the 2.4%. But if you don't get approved by the SRF program, you don't get the 25% principal forgiveness annually. The other important thing to point out is engineering and permitting costs are not covered by the SRF. That's 100% local responsibility. And so again, if we can't be eligible for the SRF, it makes it harder to work not with JBC, but to have our solution be at JBCC. So one of the things that we're still doing is trying to figure out what we would do locally if JBCC doesn't pan out. And at the same time, we would always be working with our neighboring 4 towns and the base. So when we look at the big picture costs, we're actually contracting with our wastewater consultant, Wright Pierce, to try to do a matrix to show, if the special act goes through, this would be our costs at JBCC. If the special act doesn't go through, this would be our costs at JBCC. And if we didn't get the special act, this is what our costs would be locally. So it's very complex. We've been trying to go back and forth with them about what we'd like them to analyze. It'll be a bit before we see numbers and are comfortable enough with them to share publicly. But that's pretty important because I think at some point we have to start doing actual work. And so it's fair to say that we've spent a lot of time and effort to try to go out to the base. Whether or not that pans out, we're not sure. But again, we're still looking at other things. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is the time value of money versus increased knowledge. Unfortunately, the costs on doing wastewater projects has skyrocketed. Dave's going to share some numbers in a few minutes, just what we've seen since pre-COVID and what's happened since then. But by the same token, we've benefited a lot by waiting because some of the technological improvements that have been rolled out, some of the decisions that other towns have received impacts our permits. If you look at Sandwich, if we had to go it alone, and we pointed out on that map, this one where the X is, that's one of the highest points on Cape Cod. There's virtually no wetlands nearby. If you look at Yarmouth and Dennis, they're really struggling because everywhere they want to put treated effluent back into the ground, it causes the wetlands around it to rise. And the state is trying to implement restrictions on how much they can let that water go up, even though it's treated effluent that they're disposing at the state's edict. So, what towns are having to deal with is really difficult. And in the scheme of things, ours is easier, except I would say for what we're trying to accomplish out on the base. One of the things that Dave mentioned is IA systems or innovative alternative systems. That was one of the 2 ways that the state's new regulations said towns could identify them. Here's the hard part, they don't work right now. So there's all these IA systems out there that cost way more than a normal septic system, but they haven't been proven to actually work yet. So there's an innovative septic system program that the county runs out at the base that we went on a tour of about a week and a half ago with some other town staff. And even the people who run the program say a lot of progress has been made, but they don't come close to meeting the nitrogen and phosphorus levels that they need to sort of go by what the state new regulations say. So doesn't really apply to us right now, but I guess that's one of the things, like 25 years from now, if there's a system that does that, maybe our phase 2 and 3s look a lot different than what phase 1 is. And maybe there's things people could do with their homes instead of having like a huge solution with sewering. And again, I mentioned the technological advances, improved data that we've had in science is a great example of where waiting has really helped us is the school system. So when we adopted the CWRMP in 2018, we thought all 3 schools would be forced to upgrade their systems to tertiary treatment. The estimated cost way back then, you've heard me say it too many times, was over $10 million per school, especially the high school would be higher than that. Because of the flows that actually have happened at Oak Ridge and Forestdale, and the fact that Oak Ridge flows to the north, so it doesn't flow towards an impaired watershed. We recently got a full waiver from DEP that we don't have to upgrade our treatment plant. In fact, we can go to a normal Title V system, which we'll be doing over the next year or so, which Dave will touch on in a minute. Forestdale, we're allowed to disconnect from the plant there to go to a normal Title V system, which those infiltration beds are already in existence behind the schools. The issue there is once sewering goes by, we are required to connect to the sewering at Forestdale School. And then the biggest thing we need to do is upgrade the high school, which Dave will touch on in a minute. And then just, as I had mentioned, there's regulatory decisions that are starting to happen across the Cape with other towns, and we thought we'd mention a few just because they're so unique. You know, Falmouth is trying to do that ocean outfall pipe. If that ever got approved, to me, it almost makes any land-based disposal much easier to get a permit if they're going to allow treated effluent to dispose of right in the bay. That's our to the south, but that's going to be a really hard permit for them to get. But they're trying. You know, the effluent site that we've looked at is near the canal. It's not in the canal, but it's very close to the canal. You know, the amount of volume of water that goes through the canal each way is huge. We like to say it flushes itself like the way it's designed by nature, and it really dilutes things. So I would think that would be much easier to permit if, for example, Falmouth is able to permit what they're trying to do. I mentioned the Yarmouth discharge permit, that they got all sorts of pushback because where they were disposing their effluent would cause the water to rise in a couple of their conservation type areas where there are wetlands. So they were limited to, I think, was it 1/10 of 1 foot? So what's that, like 1 point something inches? That's the most that they could cause the water level to rise as they, again, disposed of treated effluent that meets high standards. And then Barnstable has actually shared with us right now, they're seriously looking at possibly treating to such a level that the effluent that would come out of their treatment plant would meet drinking water standards. They're looking at possibly injecting it back into their public water supply. So that's pretty interesting, but that's what they're looking at. Technology is probably a ways off, but it sort of shows you the extreme that some other towns are going to. And then one thing that I wanted to touch on just on this section about the state SRF program, their draft list came out in January, and for the first time, it included a proposal that they would limit any projects to a maximum of $50 million per year and not allow those numbers to carry over from year to year. In the past, as I had mentioned, Barnstable, Chatham, Falmouth have had, you know, several hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects that were approved, you know, the full amount, and they're allowed to carry them over as work's done. I think it would be really hard for any town our size to actually do $50 million worth of work. So that's not our concern as much as it is not being able to carry over or get approval for the total amount. Because if you go to town meeting like Yarmouth and Dennis did within the past year and sought voter support for $250 million, I think Dennis's was a little more than that, and they both got approved. But if you couldn't tell the voters, and we have SRF funding to help hold down our loans to a lower interest rate for the full 250, would people say, well, if you only got it for the 50,000, how assured are you going to get it for the next 50 and then one after that? So, and the whole reason the state's doing it is because I think the word I've heard is oversubscribed. All of us are being forced to upgrade our systems on the Cape. So more and more requests are coming from us, and they exceed the amount that the SRF has to help. And again, that's not dollar for dollar when I say 50 million. It's 50 million on the times, if you borrowed it at the 2.4%. So the difference between what you actually borrowed it for and the 2.4% is what they pay, not 50 million, if that makes sense. So we sent in a letter, the select board approved us sending in a letter to the state and during the draft comment period, which expired on Monday, just to say we have concerns about this. We would like to try to be part of the solution and figure out how we do it. almost every town on the Cape sent the same thing. So that's where that sits right now. So next we'll go into the school treatment plants.
Okay, so Bud had mentioned some of the work at the school treatment plants, and part of the CWRMP is outlined dealing with the schools. Originally, we were looking at potentially even tying them in, and we got a enforcement order for the Sandwich High School. Well, not an enforcement order, it was, we were verbally made aware that due to the conditions of that system based on an inspection, that upgrades and repairs would need to be made. So we were able to have those designs prepared and at the same time utilizing some of the components that are there, the disposal that's there. That work was put out to bid, and Weston Sampson was approved the winning bidder on that, and that work is expected to be initiated and completed this coming summer. Of the summer of 2025. So that plant will still remain in place, and the Oak Ridge plant, Bud had mentioned the DEP waivers. When we were looking at those plants, we were originally talking about tying them into one of the phases, that the type of plants that they are and the condition of them, as Bud mentioned, that they would need a replacement. But when we started looking at the actual flow, those systems were designed for upwards of 15,000 gallons a day, and they're only using 5,000 gallons a day. The state requires a disposal permit for any flow over 10,000 gallons a day. And with the 5 in discussions with DEP, we were allowed to make application for Forestdale and Oak Ridge to allow them to be converted to Title V systems. Wright Pierce is now designing the minor alterations associated with that, and that work we're expecting to occur within a year. They'll do the designs, and we'll put that out to bid for those projects. And as Bud mentioned, about 10 years ago, associated with those plants, if we were to do the work out there, it'd be about $30 million. The actual cost today is $3 million, and a portion of that is through the county ARPA funds that we have of the approximately $850,000. And the remaining costs will be come from the water investment infrastructure investment fund. For that. And one of the things that the discussions we've had is oversight of those plants, because as far as the condition and the operation and maintenance of, there's been some challenges with those. And, it's been suggested, I have suggested that the town should look at taking those plants over and operating those, and potentially looking at them operating under whatever contract we have associated with wastewater, if we do, without on the base. So that we can ensure that they're being maintained and operated correctly also. And Bud had previously mentioned, looking at the costs associated with this, with the escalating costs, the phase 1 was estimated in 2018 to be $85 million. That cost estimate in 2024 after coming out of COVID was $130 million, and if we project that out to 2030, we're looking at $165 million. So Bud had mentioned the time value of money. This is why we're looking at the decisions to be made and make them sooner than later to take advantage of those anticipated costs in the future.
And I think when we say these are really high level costs, no engineering firm is going to put their hard estimate without permits. And, we don't have permits yet. We know what we want to do. We know roughly what the cost is per mile of conveyance lines. We know roughly what the cost is of a treatment plant of our size. As David mentioned, we're also looking with some smaller things that Mashpee's doing, and possibly Barnstable, to try to partner with them, because as he mentioned on those transfer development rights, or the transfer of nitrogen credits, it might be cheaper to pay for an improvement there for us to implement an improvement in our town, and the bang for buck would be a lot quicker. So one of the things that I know the committee is very familiar with is in 2019, the town was the first in the state. We adopted the Water Infrastructure Investment Fund, or WIIF, which was a 2% surcharge as voted. Recently, it was recommended and voted at town meeting in January to increase that surcharge to 3% for the very reason of the costs that are escalating. Without a doubt, and I'll go through a couple of examples in a minute, there's going to have to be debt exclusions along the way for numbers this big. But the more we're able to accomplish without doing debt, it should hold down residents' costs by being able to accomplish some of those things, either paying in cash or for debt that we'd issue that would be paid for from the WIIF, not additional charges. So the process, as the committee knows, required a town meeting vote a certain number of days before a town election. So there will be a question on the town election ballot on May 8th about whether or not the public wants to increase that surcharge from 2% to 3%. Each 1% today brings in right around $750,000 a year, and the cost on that for the average valued home is $72 annually for that additional 1%. I'm going to show you, this is attachment, I think it was the last attachment in your packet, attachment 7, but this shows that additional 1% over 25 years would bring in roughly $28 million. And then what is new that I wanted to highlight is at the bottom of that attachment, which is in your packets, we asked our engineering firm roughly what the cost would be for the phase 1 conveyance system, which they were able to give us a decent number on that. It's a much less exact number on a treatment plant and designing a treated effluent disposal site. So again, this is for design and for permitting. I ran the numbers as if we were borrowing $7.5 million at 4% for 10 years. You can see what those annual payments would be. So the nice part is that the WIIF, even the additional 1%, would cover most of those costs. Others would be covered by the 2% we're already bringing in, but would still allow us to make progress on all the other things that we're trying to get done with the money that we have, be it the school department improvements, trying to permit and design the systems that we know we're going to have to implement. So in short, the longer the WIIF could pay for some of this implementation, the less impact on property owners. But we're not trying to hide the fact that at some point, we're going to be looking at large debt exclusions, just like all the other towns on Cape have had to look at. And it's also important to note if we can use the WIIF funds to cover the non-SRF eligible expenses, that helps us because there's no state assistance or that Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund can assist us with engineering or permitting. And one of the nice things about WIIF is it's a very broad array of uses that can be used. It's everything from engineering, permitting, required land area, nitrogen credit trading, all sorts of things are covered underneath the WIIF legislation. I know it's gotten some publicity, but no decision's been made yet, but there is that federal bankruptcy court case that's going on. And the town did submit an offer for 3 parcels that added up to about 84 acres. So no final decisions have been made by the federal judge. If that went through, I'd be glad to share with you a whole bunch of details and explain why that's so important, especially if we're forced to go on our own and not go out at the base. And I think the goal, like we have for the last 3 or 4 town meetings, is that every town meeting, if there's a balance in the WIIF, we appropriate it so it can be used, so we can keep these projects moving and covering those expenses as we go. If needed, when we're done, I could look up on my phone, because I'd sent an email recently on how much we had appropriated over time, how much we've spent, what the balance is, right up to what we did in January, so I can get you that quickly if there's a question on that. But again, we just plan to include an article at every town meeting just appropriating most of what's in the balance so we can actually use it and try to hold down the larger costs.
All right, and as far as, we're attempting to continually show progress on the work we're doing. Just to have an understanding what's driving this also is that the Conservation Law Foundation took suit against the EPA, and the action with the EPA, Barnstable County, the result was the implementation of the 208 or the push for it, and part of that agreement was DEP putting in the amendment to Title V for the nitrogen sensitive areas. And hence the regulation that we're now dealing with, which has a specific time frame associated with it. So we need to keep moving on this. I know at town meeting, when we were talking about that WIIF or increased percentage, there was an individual that stood up and said, well, with the current administration, is this going to even be necessary? Well, regardless of the current administration at the federal level, this is all state regulation. So yes, we're going to have to keep doing this, and it's not going to go away because we still have the Conservation Law Foundation that can still take suit on this, and plus there's regulations in place for this. And we're working many angles on how to do this, as Bud had mentioned, the cost comparison, looking at comparisons of what scenarios are better, to deal with the situation with each of the abutting towns. But ultimately, there's many complex issues like PFAS, the Maui decision, disposal decisions, the new contaminants and contaminants of emerging concern, how we'll deal with that. And then the issues associated with dealing with the numerous entities out on the base, as far as one, the JBCC, all the leaseholders, and the federal government, the state government, and the federal government. But keep in mind, when we started looking in that direction, it was really the only option we had, because we were looking at the need for land area suitable enough for the plant and to meet the full disposal needs of our full phases. And up to this point, there's been no other options other than JBCC. So, and what it does allow, too, continuing forward on this, is that the residents of Sandwich are now asking, when is it coming? When is it going to be built? As soon as everybody's starting to repair their system and seeing the costs associated with that, they're trying to determine, should I hold off? Should I wait? Because they would rather put some money into something that they can depend on, other than not knowing they'll put money into something they don't know how long it's going to last. And then what it does also is allows us to look further at economic development as far as redevelopment of areas. And we understand that, SRF funding associated with, development in these areas, it depends upon what type of percentage we want to pay. If you're if you're not going to add, flow, it's 0%. If you're adding flow, it's going to be, a greater percent. So we understand that, but it's worth looking at and having that discussion. It also allows us to plug in affordable housing opportunities, and at the same time, what I'll refer to as the Golden Triangle. I'm not sure what it's called now, if it's some other name, as far as that goes. I mean, this goes back years of wanting to develop that, and the hurdle being we don't have wastewater capabilities to address it. And those go back to discussions years ago with Mr. Tsakoulos and how we do that. This is driving the direction we're going now, and what benefits we can reap from that for the community as it goes forward. Once a decision is made, we'll have to, as far as what option we're choosing, whether in town or JBCC, we're going to need to update CWRMP for the state for that. So that will be required to update that. And we're planning an update for the selectmen once we come together with those cost scenarios, so that we have a decision-making tool at that point. Then we'll put that before the public, so there's an understanding of where we're going with that.
So I would say definitely when we do the update with the select board, we'll have the engineers from Wright Pierce present, and I'll make sure that we invite everyone to come to that, because that will get into more technical details. This was just an overview as best we could on some of the bigger irons that we have in the fire, but I don't know, it's hard, it's frustrating. I feel like we make progress, but then we don't really quite implement things. So I know both of us are really excited to actually address the school problems. Like, that's been over our head for a long time. That will feel like some progress. And I think, as David mentioned, probably the biggest thing that we need to look at is, do we go to the base in the beginning, later on, or do we treat it in town and work with the base and our neighbors the whole way like we always have? I think it's fair to say, because their percentage of responsibility is way greater than ours, Barnstable's way ahead of us for good reason, and our contribution to them is fairly small, so there may be a way we can piggyback with them with cash as opposed to bigger projects that will have more bang for the buck than having to overbuild something in Sandwich that isn't going to have a huge effect in Barnstable. And same thing with Pompanesett. I think Wacoit Bay is of the three, it's the furthest down the road. If you know where Falmouth Treatment Plant is, which is sort of in the southwest corner of their town, Wacoit is the furthest point southeast, right near the Mashpee border. They've been very upfront with us that, as they expand their system, that's the last line. So there might be things we look at to try to help them closer to the source as opposed to doing something in Sandwich that would, benefit them in 30 years when the water makes it down there. And I think that's the hardest thing about all this. It's not like we can pay money and say, okay, that's done with our responsibility. You have to see what happens with the nitrogen levels and all sorts of other things along the way. So it's sort of it's not a new world, but it's sort of we got to get going. We can't just talk about it forever. I still think we need to make the best decision we can for the cheapest overall expense long term. And I think if we had to guess, we think that's about 2 years away. Can we get that special act pushed through quicker than that? That might help us make a decision. It's hard. And I don't know, Bill, do you want to add anything or are you good?
No, I appreciate it, Bud. I think you and Dave have covered quite a bit. I just wanted to let the committee know that, when Ed and myself and Crystal had met before, I guess, the beginning of budget season, when we went over the calendar and wanted to cover what topics we wanted to cover during the budget cycle. This was really important for me to get this in front of the committee. As Dave mentioned earlier on, this is probably the largest capital project, not only in Sandwich, but all of Cape Cod currently. So I think it's important that the committee gets all of the available information, and there's no two better people than give you that information than Bud and Dave currently. So I'm just happy you guys are able to get this information tonight, and just again, happy to answer any questions you have on later on tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dave and Bud. Bill, appreciate it. Complex, as you've said. Comments, questions from members? Go ahead, Jackie.
So if I understand, if the act does not pass, then we would tend to go it alone. And if we do that and invest, did I hear that the potential is for future phases, we still might use JBCC, at which point they figure out what they're going to do? Is there a point of no return where we've invested so much going it alone that would not make sense? Or is it always going to be an option to hook back up with JBC?
No, I think JBCC is a potential option as you look at the phases. I'd say that if we were to go on our own, that's definitely taking care of phase one. But then if you look at portions of phase 2 and phase 3 out towards Forestdale, as far as we'd have to look at the expense associated with running the effluent and lift stations and everything from that point off of Snake Pond Road, to the treatment plant versus maybe we do go to JBCC at that point as far as how the crow flies. We're continually looking at keeping all options on the table to be able to say, to pick out what area, we don't care where the effluent goes. We're just responsible for getting rid of it and treating it. So, and doing so for the cheapest way possible also. So as far as to your question, though, is some point in return? I think we just need to be flexible and keep all our options on the table.
We can see where in future phases it would be possible, even if we've...
Yes.
I think what's a shame if we had support from the beginning to go out to the base and we were able to start that work a couple years ago. Right now, without doing major things to their plant, they have a certain volume that they could take from us without us having to pay for a lot of big upgrades. So I know that's one thing that we've talked about with Converge out there, because they technically hold the permit now, and DEP is more of a permit review entity than it is giving us answers on some of those higher level questions we've been asking them. They've even bandied about okay, do we file an application with the state and say right now we're getting less than 70,000 gallons per day. We want to go to the 450 that we're allowed, and we're going to work with Sandwich to make up that difference. That would take a big chunk of our phase one, and we could probably save some decent money by doing it if the state would say yes, we agree to that.
Yeah. I mean, if we could go today based on their reserve capacity associated with the plant and the disposal, they could take our phase one tomorrow. And the problems they're having right there now are, so it would be I'm saying it's 240,000 gallons it calculates out to. It'd be about 300,000, but they would be able to take it. Right now, the plant is, for what they're working out there, the plant's not working correctly. They're adding Pepsi syrup to the system out there to add carbon source in order to have the system work correctly. They need more flow, and it's not working because they don't have enough flow. But we're being told, we can't add to it because of the PFAS associated, that was previous contamination. So.
Thanks.
Matt?
So why hasn't Converge made application for that permit to take additional flow? I would assume it would be in their best interest to have a permit in place regardless of what town they're working with, whether it be future base flow from us, flow from other towns.
So their permit is coming up for renewal. So, and I think what they're attempting to do is, when they make application for the permit, what's the best way to do that? What should be included in that? As far as should this flow be included in that? So I think they'll be making application. It was just what the components of the application are. The last conversation I had with Converge was just do it. Make DEP make a decision. Mm-hmm. Make application, submit it, and let's get a yes and no, so then we know what direction we're going. Because the biggest challenge here is to make application and get that yes or no is the time and money spent associated with that. If you get no, now you're starting over again. And I'd rather, have them spend their money now to get that answer.
And I assume I'm way oversimplifying it in my head on the permitting process is probably why the permitting
I think that's
hasn't been started.
A big thing, and the problem is if the current ribs are contaminated with PFAS, they may want us to identify a new disposal site. And so a lot of our conversations, I would say the last 6 to 12 months have been, where's the best place for a new disposal site? And what's hard is the northern 15,000 acres at the base, or a lot of it's protected habitat or active training ground. And so some of the areas we've looked at are just off the base boundary, but owned by the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we've participated in a couple of meetings with the Corps and sent letters supporting Converge saying, would the Corps entertain, I think the volume of land they need is about 45 acres, 50 acres. Would they lease that back to the base so that they could put treated effluent there? And I think the Army Corps is rightfully saying, well, you have 15,000 acres on the northern part of the base. Why do you need 50 acres from us? So it's like this chicken and egg thing. And I think both sides have a lot of merit, but nothing's getting hatched.
And at the same time, where the 50 acres is, are we going to get whacked with the whole issue of the Maui decision based on, effluent, making its way into the canal, and we can't get an answer on that.
Does the current 75,000 gallons that they're treating, does that get dispersed into that rib field that is currently?
Yes, it's going to the existing disposal area.
Just, I point up to the stage because prior to COVID, we had, as I said, we had those 3 regional grants. So we had a ton of momentum. So literally all 5 towns, DEP, EPA, the Buzzards Bay Coalition, really any Conservation Law Foundation came once. We were inviting everyone. We were meeting monthly on the stage because we were the easiest place for the DEP people to come to for years. And then COVID hit, and we thought we were making progress, and it's just come to a grinding halt. But now that's 4+ years ago. So that's really frustrating that we can't, at some point we're going to have to move.
Bob?
Thanks to you both. Good presentation. It's going to really be interesting when numbers show up. So that'll be good. Just a couple of questions, if I may. So Converge is a private, for-profit organization, is that correct? And is the pricing of their services in any way regulated or subject to approval? And if so, who's regulating pricing and who's approving pricing?
Yeah, we haven't gotten that far yet.
Okay.
That's a good point, yeah.
My understanding is that throughout Massachusetts, it is quite common for water treatment facilities to be public facilities, right? Public water treatment plants. So I found
In
the
this
notion
state.
of a privately owned enterprise interesting. And interesting to me that the organization who owns it is essentially subcontracting the management to yet another for-profit organization. So I think it's going to be vitally important to understand pricing,
Yes.
right? So that's an interesting piece of information. Dave, you were somewhat critical of the maintenance and supervision of the wastewater treatment facilities at the schools and suggested that, I'm assuming, some town organization or a private enterprise hired by the town should be supervising the wastewater treatment plant at the schools, because I'm going to put words in your mouth, they've been neglected. We should discuss that further, right? We have a history of hearing stories of failure to maintain, failure to supervise wasted assets, and then we have to do cleanup work. So that's more commentary than question, I guess. I would think that to further this conversation and our own understanding as a board, we're going to need to see a complete, or as complete as possible, a list of capital projects under consideration, not only for water, but throughout the town. It seems to me every time I pick up the Enterprise or look on social media, there's a town organization talking about spending millions for improvements, repairs, whatnot. I think it's vitally important for the Finance Committee to see all of the lists of proposed or contemplated or necessary capital expenditures, and to have a discussion with Bud and the rest of the town about how we prioritize those spends. So I think that'd be worth getting after as well. Bud, you specifically mentioned debt exclusions, and I think I would tie that in as well. The impact of debt exclusions for water and all these other contemplated capital expenses. And to the comments made earlier, it would be really important to understand how that impacts taxes, right? So great presentation. We're missing some numbers, which is understandable. There have been a few presentations to the Finance Committee of major expenditures without numbers. And I guess my final comment, rather than a question, would be, in order for the Finance Committee to do its job, we're actually going to see numbers at some point. Thanks.
Kevin? Oh, did you want to?
I was just going to, I agree 100% with what Bob said. I thought he had a great point at the special town meeting that we have to try to estimate some of these bigger picture costs, be it the only other one on the town side I can think of is that new DPW facility / downtown fire station. I know the schools are looking at trying to do a bigger picture review of some of their capital needs. And then obviously the wastewater, those are the three big ones. Unfortunately, the wastewater numbers are staggering, and they're everywhere, but they're staggering. And so you're exactly right, when we get better numbers,
Yeah.
I think we felt pretty good with the WIIF money that we're bringing in now, how the bids came in on the school project. So the high school came in, like, I think the contract I signed was like roughly 1.85 million. That we think a rough estimate, which again, those plans are being done, because just to physically explain, can I just divulge for a sec? When that high school plan is fully fixed, upgraded, we know it's working, everyone signs off on it, that's when I think we should look at and I think the schools would love this, and that's why I think when one of the bullet points says the school committee's probably going to need to vote to transfer the ownership or like responsibility of that asset to the town. And then our goal, because we don't want a single additional employee, our goal is to contract out to a wastewater firm that would oversee that operation and whatever maintenance is needed, whatever monthly testing is needed, all that stuff. So we stay on top of it and we can keep them in a great condition for decades. Lost my train of thought, but when you look at this number about the borrowing of the $7.5 million, I was actually pleased when I saw those numbers and what our WIIF annual income is, even without the 1%, because I think we want to put off asking for debt as long as we can. But eventually there's going to come a time when you go to do, you can't put in X number of miles of conveyance lines and a treatment plant and a disposal system and expect to be able to do it, within 3%. You can't.
To Bob's point on capital, next week, the Finance Committee is going to cover capital both on the town side and the school side, but I'm not sure how much of any of the wastewater is in even the long-range plan. Is any of that in there, or can we begin to get a glimpse of it, even if it's several years out?
I would think maybe a year from now we'll be able to have a bunch of money and try to run some realistic scenarios. I think we'll know a number on that DPW fire project probably within the next 30 days, I would think. The school stuff, I don't know, because I think that's the cost to even hire a company to come in is a lot more than we thought to give us an estimate on what those improvements would take.
Kevin.
I'm going to try and be brief. A couple of things, and for what Bob said, that we need to get numbers. We really do, and we need to get, you're not going to get accurate numbers now, but you need to get them as close as you can. I've been listening to all this. 10 years ago, we were told that the schools was going to be 30 million. 10 years ago, you could have built 3 treatment plants at the schools for 10 million, not 30. Now you could build them for 12 to 15. So that number was always way off. I am so glad you were able to do the upgrades to the high school and not need to do the upgrades for 3 million. That's awesome. So that's all I want to say on that part of it. Next thing, if you could actually put up the map on the phasing. I have questions. The way we've got this phased, we have phase 1 in red, and then phases 2 and 3 in green, and then yellow. Almost all of phase 1 is outside of the nitrogen-sensitive area. It's an area of town that needs wastewater, needs it addressed. But we're looking at trying to get enactment to allow us to do SRF for money spent on the base. Even if we got SRF eligible, if we're not handling nitrogen in phase 1, state may say, you're eligible, you're just not getting funded because you are the bottom of the list. And at that point, you've gone a long way without actually being able to access the money, which then brought up the Cape Cod Fund. Do you actually have to get SRF approval or SRF funding in order to get the Cape Cod money?
Yeah, my understanding is it has to be approved on the list and then also approved for funding. Okay. And so in our comments back to the state that we sent last Friday, I think I know what you're getting at. I said, if you have to put a cap on us, could you at least say we're SRF approved, even though you're not going to fund it, and then we could go ahead and borrow the money and then get the 25% reimbursement, because that's really where we save the money more so than...
All we need to be is approved, not actually SRF funded.
That's what we talked about as a group, and so that was included in several letters that some of the people sent back.
Okay, and when I look at it, phases 2 and 3, which address the nitrogen sensitive, also makes the most sense going to the base. Phase 1 is as far away from the base as you can get and would be the most expensive to get it there. So I'm not sure, in some ways, what if the phasing is out of step or if really what we want is phase 2 and 3 going to the base, phase 1 maybe going to the base, or maybe stand alone.
So, and I know you've brought up in the past, Kevin, as far as the, that it's not in a, phase 1 is not in a nitrogen-sensitive area, and that's understood. Again, we're going to be updating our CWRMP when we define what direction we're going here, when we say we're either going, in town here or to the base, or perhaps an option of. Some of the phasing can change also associated with that. The purpose of the way the phasing's set up now, as far as it's phase 1's taking advantage of the land that's available in town. The land that was set aside in 2012 it represents that, because we couldn't provide disposal area for 2 and 3. So it's a juggling act. I get your point. We understand that. We've talked about that and looked at that as far as, but there's the ability to expand beyond, into phase 2 and phase 3 based on the direction we're going, with this also. And at the same time, going to, phase 1, going like the downtown area, going to the base, it may be the furthest. At that point, we didn't have a potential land option on the table when this decision was made. This is, to me, as far as if this was to go through, is a deal breaker. A deal breaker in terms of the decision making and giving us the ability to hold all the cards to make the decisions we want. To alter this and go the direction we want also.
Okay. The next one I wanted to ask about, and this is totally different, but the nitrogen credits. The deals, nitrogen credits, you're essentially paying another town to do improvements on their town to handle the nitrogen, which makes sense, because that way you're handling the nitrogen closer to the resource area. You get more bang for your buck. But I then look at it, are you paying for the capital cost of it, or are you paying for capital and O&M? Is it a continuing cost forever, and how are we going to pay it?
Yeah, I think what's been discussed is the capital cost. All those scenarios have been brought up, and as far as what's the value of a pound of nitrogen, as far as what that value is. It's been looked at that the capital cost, because it's something that will probably have to increase over time also, depending upon the Sentinel, sampling stations, as far as what's working and what's not, and whether we have to pull out more. That's an understood consideration going forward. At the same time, looking at this, and I'll simplify this with 3 bays, we're, running a couple scenarios now. What would, if we did alternative systems in that area that contributes to 3 bays, would it work? We've talked about, when Bud mentioned that alternative systems don't work, they work, but they don't reach the limits, just so it doesn't reduce nitrogen to the limits necessary. So, we're doing a whole comparison just for 3 bays to say, well, okay, if we sewer down in Barnstable, for Barnstable, versus the cost of doing IAs, and does it worse versus the cost of sewering in Sandwich in that area that's in the watershed. So as you say, you want numbers to compare what those costs are in total, so we have an understanding how that decision is made. Does that make sense as far as?
It does, but I'm kind of looking at it. Is it a couple $1 million a year? Yeah, probably. Is that a couple $1 million, forever to cover O&M or capital? Is any of that fundable? Can we get loans for some of that? SRF for that?
SRF is fundable for that, yes.
So we've got that portion of it. We could say our capital cost is going to be $2 million a year, but the first 20 years we're paying for the capital. Can we get a loan for that and get some of that reimbursed by the Cape Cod group? I think that was really it, is how are we going to fund that, and can it be reimbursed? And are we paying that out of WIIF or new taxes, or
Yeah, understood. Bud can answer the future. But as far as the money goes, I think I just keep, my job is to move this concept arrangements and relationships along. And I think as far as the numbers, the costs associated and what we put down for numbers will be based on the decisions that we'll be making in the near future. I think right now we're too many things up in the air to allow us to define that.
Right, but you were in the process of signing nitrogen credit agreements.
Not as of yet, no. We haven't gotten to that point. We have an intermunicipal agreements, basically stating that, recognizing our percent of responsibility of what we contribute in that watershed, but developing those watershed permits based on that information. Like I said, right now with 3 bays as the example, we're running those scenarios now. That contract is out with Ed Eichner through SMAS to give us some, first to identify what our contribution is, update our contribution, define those, run those scenarios, and then apply a cost to those before we get to the finalization of the permit.
Jackie?
So does that mean that it does make sense to revisit the plan and talk about some, scenarios if you make progress with the framework for how, for how we would do the credits, and we kind of have an understanding of at least the framework, whether it's capital and operating and what portion is what, and can estimate that just takes that right out of the plan, essentially. I mean, it's just right off the top, that's done, and then there's a phase 1 investment, and then there, so we like isolate the unknowns.
Yes.
A little bit more.
Right.
Is the idea to recreate a plan with best thinking on some of these things?
Well, as far as recreating the plan, I mean, this was what we can revisit this multiple times and then resubmit it and have it approved, and then it just becomes, it's possible. It's just, do you want to spend that money? If we already spent, $850,000 on it.
Yeah, and not so much that it's all buttoned up and documented and approved.
Yeah.
It's really, I guess, more to Bob's point about helping us get to those numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Faster, and then, being able to see where's there going to be debt exclusion, how do we...
Right, okay, I understand now where you're going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that type of analysis is going to be put together to justify each time with each component, if we break it into smaller pieces, why we're, the decision-making tools. Here's the scenarios, and justifying the costs associated to put the cost for the decision-making.
Yeah.
Just a couple quick points. Like I recall this statistic when Ed Leonard, who's our primary contact at Wright Pierce, was working on this implementation map. I think he added up all the homes that are in any color of any of the 3 phases, and it's well under 30% of our homes. So it's interesting in Sandwich, it's a huge problem. The numbers are staggering, and yet less than a third of our town really needs to be a part of addressing the problems, when, Falmouth, I think almost 100% of their homes. And when you compare our numbers to all the towns on the Cape, I think the only ones less than us are probably Brewster, because they don't have any impaired watersheds in their town, just like us, and they only contribute, I think, to 1 to the south, and it's a really small percent. So they're looking at small, almost improvements to their pond quality and their drinking water quality, as opposed to big wastewater. And then I think when you go out down Cape, like for example, so much of Truro is part of the National Seashore. Like, granted, there's only like 1,500 year-round people there, but their numbers are probably smaller than ours. But other than those 2 or 3 towns, like we, believe it or not, have about the cheapest bill, which is still staggering when you look at the numbers, which is depressing.
Well, Bourne will have the cheapest bill because they're telling all their residents to put in IA systems. Well, that's somewhat of the plan.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the comments around, Bud, you made about hope and frustration getting to the base. Is there some trigger ahead of getting a no or a yes that says we've got to change directions and focus in on the alternatives?
I would think
Is there a trigger?
I would say there's two triggers. If the legislature tells us you're not getting the special act, and if Converge goes ahead and tries to get permission to use their differential between what they're using now and what they're permitted to do by taking it from us, and that gets told no, then I think for the time being, we're dead out there. But I don't think it's forever, but at some point, like, we got to
Is there
get
any
things
view
done.
that those might come before getting a yes or no?
We don't understand, so we really hope by this meeting with the state treasurer's office, we might get some insight from them on what concerns they may have. What's interesting is the committee that our special act was referred to recommended it out without any changes to the draft. So you would have thought if they were hearing concerns from state departments, they might have said, we're not going to recommend it out until you revote it with these changes. We did get, because it was, in the end, it switched from the House to the Senate, the committee that was overseeing it. And so we did get questions from the Senate counsel's office that John Giorgio responded to quickly. That was sent on Halloween, and we haven't gotten an answer yet. And now that it wasn't passed by January, my guess is, we're not going to hear from them until the next one gets close to getting acted on.
And
So we're trying to sort of outreach to all these different state offices, so if we have to vote a slightly amended act, we could do it in May. That's our goal.
Because in the thought that the SRF funding is involving a private entity, each state is given their ability to determine how the SRF funding is utilized and the constraints associated with it. There are states that allow private entities to receive SRF funding. So it's not unheard of. It's not new. It's being done. It's just a matter of, I think the concern is the potentially the lack of control, and what the underlying here is the fact that, if Converge were to fail, the state takes over the plant. So it's in their agreement that it reverts back to the state no matter what. So the state has control of the plant, that has control of the money regardless of.
The other point, and I should have said this earlier, like, ASUS is like a huge, highly impressive company that runs utility systems, not just wastewater plants, but wastewater plants, water plants, utility lines on some of the biggest bases in the country. Like, if Fort Bragg, huge ones in North Carolina, Texas. I mean, that's what they do for a living. They know what they're doing. It's not, what they're doing here isn't any, it's on a much, much smaller scale than what they're used to doing. So we have a lot of faith in their knowledge, and we've been really impressed working with them. It's just trying to get over that stigma, as Bob said, like a privately owned treatment plant as opposed to a publicly owned one. And some of the restrictions in Massachusetts, as Dave said, they don't go to the full limit of what the Clean Water Act allows them to go to.
And have we called upon Representative Zerios and Senator Fernandez to help with the treasurer's
Yep. So
efforts?
that, and we've just tried to get them to help with the special act to try to help shepherd it through as fast as we could. And it's fair to say DEP is very nervous because they don't want to talk for what EPA ultimately decides. And so I think that's been a challenge. It's almost like if we were at this stage 5 years ago, I think we would have gotten the act through. I think we would have been moving. But
Nancy?
What about the existing septic systems? Are there any new requirements coming down for them? And will there be any kind of waivers for areas that are getting close to hookups so that people aren't changing out their systems and then having to hook up right away?
You mean for those areas that are to be sewered?
Well, both. I mean, if you're going to be sewered and then your system fails within maybe a year or two, is there any kind of waiver, to help you out? Or the people who are not being sewered, are there are there any additional requirements the next time they need to replace?
Okay, so those that aren't being sewered, it depends upon where they are in town. 'Cause I know there was a comment made at one point that everyone's going to need IA systems. That's not the case. We're trying to avoid that all the way around. If you're in an unsewered area, you'd basically, or if you're not in an impaired, the watershed of an impaired estuary, you're just putting in your standard Title V system. At that point, you're just doing a repair as is done today. As far as those that are within those phases, there's many mechanisms in place, and that would come under the regulations of sewer, for the sewer commissioners, which are the selectmen. Those determinations can be made as far as, when you hook up and what type of work is done and how long you wait. We're working with DEP right now with the nursing home Heritage, because they have a groundwater discharge permit, but, we're trying to time it, and so they're allowing some allowances with the understanding that we, within what time frame we'll be providing them the ability to connect. So, there's mechanisms for that.
That's helpful.
I want to stress what Kevin said. This is really, really rough. When we asked Wright Pierce to try to look at those high level, like, cost comparisons, obviously you have to make certain assumptions. So when we get those, there'll be certain high level assumptions just to, so we're looking at as level a playing field as we can. They thought that if we went it alone, if we knew that within 2 years, it would be roughly 8 years before the conveyance system was built, the plant was operational, and we were actually pumping. If we go out on the base, because the permitting is likely going to be harder and more of a challenge, that might be closer to 12 to 13 years from now. But if we could hook up to what's there already, we could do that pretty quickly. Like, one of our thoughts at Forestdale, and I think I started to say this on one of Bob's questions and then I stopped, was so at Oak Ridge and Forestdale, as David said, our engineering company is working on the physical changes, because right now when the water fountain's run and the toilet's flushed, it goes into the treatment plant. There has to be a separation of that and then a connection to the normal Title V leaching systems in the back. So that's one part of the project. And then once that work's done at both schools, like, personally, we would like to see then another contract issued to totally clear out those treatment buildings, because Forestdale, for example, if we ever went out on the base, that could be a perfect pump station right there, because we've looked, and ASUS and Converge have looked. The quickest way to get to the base isn't Snake Pond Road. It would be going through the Forestdale School, connecting with the
Greenway Road,
which is across from the Coke plant, running to the closest building that's connected to the base system. That looks like the shortest run. So that old building where the current treatment plant is at Forestdale could be valuable if it was, totally cleared out, kept clean, kept open. And if we had to build something there, it's right there.
But are there going to be impacts to either fiscal 26 or perhaps even as your outlook to 27 if the increased surcharge for the WIIF is not approved?
I think
at the ballot?
Yeah, I would think short term we'd be okay. I think depending on the cash flow and how long the permitting takes and the design of the conveyance system, it might be when we actually did the design of the treatment plant and the disposal system. And I think, as we've said a couple times, it's really the disposal permits that's probably the hardest of all three components. But it doesn't mean we can't issue debt. It's just that we would have to carry that debt out for enough years so we could pay for the annual payments from within the WIIF.
Any further questions, comments? Andrew?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I preface this by saying I'm a wastewater plant operator, but at the same time, this feels like a 1950s or 60s solution to a 21st century problem. There's got to be a way technology can take care of this without all this digging, because this is going to be a disaster, an expensive disaster.
Mm-hmm. I know, I hope.
We'd welcome that.
Yeah. Honest to God, if those IA systems got to the level where they worked, and I mean, I think we all believe in
And there's a delay.
truth, justice, the American way. We'll figure out a way to do
There's
it.
also a huge delay.
Yeah.
If you could put this in tomorrow, it'd be 20 years before the nitrogen changed in the estuary.
Right.
So when's the
Right.
timeline? If it takes 30 and it takes 20, when do we declare victory on this? I mean,
Not,
this is going to be 70 years later. We
Yeah.
won't even know if this even worked.
Nope, I'm going to have no idea.
It could all be for nothing.
right.
The technologies that exist out there are the on-site IA systems or a sewer line. That's what it, or urine diversion.
I mean, we put a man on the moon 50 years ago now. There should
Yeah.
be a way this can be solved without all of it.
Yeah.
One would
It should
believe
be.
so.
And I also think the reason like people haven't been on our case, i.e. the Conservation Law Foundation, EPA, is because we don't have any impaired estuaries, and our percentages to those three things are between 9 and 6%. So we're not a big contributor, but we do contribute. So I think that's one of the reasons we've been able, because other towns have been got notified, like, hey, if you don't do something soon, we're suing you directly. We haven't gotten anything like it, and I think we could point to a ton of things we've tried to do, but we can't get straightforward answers. If someone around the table could develop that system.
I think it's to no one's benefit for those
Yeah.
systems to work. I think everybody's making money off of doing it this way.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's getting rich. So the solution won't make anybody enough money to bother doing it. The easier solution.
I think we half jokingly say, what if down the road the Bay and the Scorton Creek estuaries go south and are negative? Then we're looking at the whole town at that point, which that would be crazy.
Okay, anything further from anyone? All right. Thank you again. We'll move on to the rest of our agenda under old business. I have one item I want to bring forth. So I've reached out via email 3 times to Dr. Marushek about receiving responses to the questions and comments I've sent to him on behalf of the committee. We had one response during our February 11th meeting that those answers would be forthcoming. I'll continue to follow up, and we'll be adding those to questions that I've received from some of you in the last couple of weeks, and in advance of next Tuesday's meeting. Personally, this is more than disappointing, given several public and other commitments I've received from Dr. Marushek and the school committee about being responsive to Finance Committee requests for insights and clarity into the school department's fiscal 2026 budget. Does anyone else have any other old business that we had not anticipated? Okay. Next item on the agenda is new business. Does anyone have any new business? Yes, Jim.
Yes, I was wondering, at some point, could we get an update on the roads situation? Now, in the budget, is the roads are covered through the bond? Is that correct, the bond we passed years ago, or?
Yeah, so we've spent all those funds on the road improvements. So I think that last report, which came out, I think it was in February of 2022, recommended if we could come up with between state money and ours, 2.6 million a year, we should be able to keep roads at a certain level. And so that's always been our goal. So right now we're at about 2 million between the state money and our money. So if we could come up with that extra 560,000 is what we've identified in the DPW budget. That's the difference between the 3.65% general government budget and the 6.05. That would get us to the 2.6 million. So I think we'd have legs at that point to try to avoid doing another road bond and just try to keep improving things at a higher level. And so I know the select board's going to vote on whether or not they support that slightly higher budget Thursday night.
Okay. So how do we decide what to spend on the roads each year? Because although we have, these big capital projects and this, that, and the other thing, and these nice buildings, if the roads aren't good, we can't get there. And I know that's one of the biggest concerns I hear from people when I was on the told them on the finance committee is, what about our roads? And I guess that's really the question I have is, what about our roads?
Yep. DPW has an extensive list of like the ratings of the roads, and like I think they gave out a handout at the last meeting, like if they got that extra money, these would be the extra roads they'd address in the next 5 years, knowing that it's not an exact science, but that was their intent.
And I wasn't here at the last meeting, so.
Can get that, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
And Jim, there'll be an opportunity for follow-up questions. Perhaps this can be one of the items that Bill and Bud prepare for our March 18th meeting, where it's kind of an open discussion meeting about questions we have surrounding the entire budget.
That'd be perfect. Thank you.
Any other new business? Jackie, looks like you have something.
I have a question. So in the beginning of the meeting, we heard some public comment about, being able to translate some of the things that are being considered in the budget to what the average taxpayer would. Who would take something like that up? And I'm sorry if I'm.
Bill and I can calculate that fairly easily. We'd first want to, what's hard right now is the state numbers are speculative. Like, we pretty much know what they are. They're not going to change drastically, but it's hard. My guess is, like, you're looking for an accurate ballpark number, not like to the penny, but we can pretty much get you to the penny based on that. So, and when we do all the articles at town meeting, we calculate what the tax impact is on each. So we do that already. It's just, are we able to do it a little bit earlier than normal? I'm sure if Bill and I can find the time, we can give you a rough idea. For example, like if the two budgets that we're looking at,
That's what I was thinking.
like what's the difference and what would be the impact for the average homeowner?
Right.
We could do that.
Because that might drive us to say,
Yeah.
there's a budget, there's an optimal
Right.
budget. Is there a suboptimal
Right.
budget?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great.
If I
Go ahead,
may,
Bill.
we can
Go ahead.
we can certainly present that and get those two numbers for you. I would just exercise caution with the average tax bill. Tax bills vary greatly. So yes, we can give an average for what it would cost, but it's really important for people to understand that, when we tell them the average tax bill, we can base that off of what the average value is of the house. But granted, some people's house is well below that average and vice versa. Some people's are way above that. But we can certainly put that data together for you. That's not an issue.
But for example, if it was the $560,000 difference, because I do these numbers all the time, it's a little bit more than $50 per person per year for the average bill for the extra money for the roads. But I can get you a better number when the time comes.
Anyone else for new business? Okay, next item on the agenda is public forum. Any further comments from anyone there? Not hearing any there. We'll move on to closing remarks. Anyone have any closing remarks? I'll just mention a big thanks again to Bud and Dave for the continued updates and insights into complex plans, both in the near and the long term, that the town's taking and being responsive. I think dialogues like this are going to continue to be important. Finance Committee, I think, is a good place for those discussions to happen. So welcome back at any time from my perspective. The next Finance Committee meeting is planned for next week. Krista will chair that meeting as I have a planned absence. At that meeting, the committee will hear from Superintendent Forget from the Upper Cape Technical Regional High School. He'll provide a brief overview of their fiscal 2026 budget and their plans. We'll also have presentations from both the town and schools on their capital budget requests for fiscal 26. This will also be an opportunity for the Finance Committee to hear from and put forth any further questions or comments to the school department's fiscal 2026 budget and plans. If there are any focus areas that you want anyone that's presenting next week to bring forth, please send those to me or to Bill, and we'll make sure that those are passed along. With that, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion?
Motion by Crystal, second by Nancy. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Thank you all. Good evening.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bill.